Welcome to MAP, the bi-weekly market access podcast hosted by me, Dr. Stefan Walzer. I am the innovator of Market Access 4.0 and a health economist by training and working in the fields of market access, reimbursement, pricing, and health economics since 2004. Discover Market Access 4.0 and unveil the future with our innovative solutions. Max Insights, our fast and easy AI-based reimbursement planning platform. Dobo, our new revolutionizing way of creating reimbursement dossiers across the globe with the first and only dossier writing AI bot. Cubo, our new AI-based objection handling platform. And Waffle, train with Waffle's virtual reality genius in an immersive environment and with an AI-based counterpart. We are Market Access 4.0. So check out our website, marketaccess4-0.com. And now let's dive into the current discussions, processes, and trends in market access across the globe. So welcome again to another episode of the Market Access podcast. I'm very happy today that we have, I would say, a quite special topic. We obviously always speak about market access. We have already spoken, discussed about real-world evidence, but today we combine those two pieces with another important topic, at least across Europe and maybe as well Canada, which is GDPR. And we're coming to the point what that is and where the impact is. I'm very happy to have today two very special and great guests. One is Douglas Drake and the other one is Adam Skali. And both of you, big welcome. And of course, maybe quickly introduce yourself.
I'll let Adam start.
Sure. So thank you very much, Stefan, for the opportunity of being on this podcast. So as a brief introduction, I work mostly as a freelance consultant with a few different organizations and companies, mostly trying to take ideas from idea to the market. I do this with a pharma company in Spain. Also, I'm advisor for a think tank in Morocco whose president is a former Minister of Health, and also with a few think tanks and initiatives in Switzerland.
Great. My name is Doug Drake. I've been in life science healthcare for over 30 years. In the last 10 years, actually working extensively on how to reuse data to actually improve patient care and outcomes. So this is a topic very close to my heart. And I believe that secondary use of data is really very, very important, that we understand how medications can work more effectively, medical devices as well, and eventually also how that can be used across the whole ecosystem through reimbursement and commercial access.
Perfect. Thank you both. So before we maybe combine let's say the three different important pieces, maybe Adam, you could maybe just start by firstly maybe explaining GDPR, the legislative framework, in very lay kind of words, I would guess, and maybe you related already a bit with the use of real-world data. And then thereafter, I think we can maybe bring the market access piece in there, even though obviously in a lot of market access discussions we have, and Douglas, you mentioned already very briefly, real-world data obviously play an important role. But maybe start really stepwise with GDPR and the link to real-world evidence.
So I think that everyone is quite familiar with GDPR. It's basically a law that actually is intended to give control of the data to the citizens. In the case of healthcare, we speak mostly of patients instead of citizens, but in the end, it's actually the same. And I think that one of the most important things when it comes to GDPR and real-world data is actually understanding that GDPR is, as Douglas mentioned in the article, more of a legislative definition rather than a technical one. So what this actually means is that we don't have some specific standards that we're going to use, but rather that each region might actually understand it and implement it in a slightly different way. So this actually can be a pretty big inconvenience when it actually comes to using the data mainly for secondary use or for any other kind of use. So what's interesting and what's problematic about this is that it means that for any kind of use of data, you have to consider each region, how they use GDPR, how they implement it, and how to actually combine it with different regions, and the limitations that this actually means. A bit of a broad answer, but that's about it.
No. I thought it's a very nice one because I mean it doesn't, let's say, play a lot with definitions, especially around GDPR, etc. And I think an important point, which is maybe as well going directly to the question around market access, Douglas, is I mean you mentioned the regional kind of differences, right? So I mean market access is obviously different between and across different European countries. So this is then, let's say, giving already a bit of a hint, right? Where maybe GDPR, when using real world evidence, maybe gets a bit of a tricky situation. Is that the case, Douglas?
Very much so, because what you see is that because it's essentially a legal definition, you're going to have different interpretations. For example, France versus Germany versus Italy versus Spain, and even on a regional level. And that has actually also greatly limited the ability to aggregate data across regions and even pull data together even across different institutions. And this has led to really a very polarization of the data and what we could use as already existing healthcare data to really understand patient outcomes, cohorts, and really understand basic epidemiology. This then trickles up all the way into the health technology assessments, where many times they're looking for regional data around what value for care that they can establish, and they're not able to consider data that's not within their explicit region. And even, for example, within Spain and Italy, you may have different HTA definitions by region, by, for example, Valencia versus Madrid and vice versa. That then establishes a different value in terms of value for care and a potential difference in value or reimbursement and patient care value. And so that fragmentation has really left Europe in a very, very, I would say, fragmented place. And this starts with really just that legal definition of what data is, how it can be used, how it can be viewed, how it can be shared across regions. The EU is one of the biggest global markets as a union, but healthcare has somehow fallen out and is not part of that definition. And so you still see a lot of these healthcare decisions on a local level and not on a global union level. And that's obviously a competitive disadvantage when you look at larger markets, such as, for example, the United States, where 330 million US lives is the single largest healthcare market in the world. Europe actually is larger, but because it's so fragmented, it's actually not at advantage. And you see that in also new medications being released, approved, and how that trickles down first into Germany and then elsewhere through the union, many times 5 or 6 years later.
Yeah, I think that's, very, very interesting point. Obviously, if you say local is maybe then driving rather the data you can, let's say, gather. This is basically, let's say, against the European Union's idea, right? Where we, let's say, at least from an economics perspective, we always, let's say, speak about a common market, which is still not true anyway in health, right? But I think, especially from a data perspective, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So maybe, Adam, if I can come back again very quickly to the clinical, let's say, study kind of point of view, right? And again, that kind of link what also Douglas just basically opened up, right? How does this kind of fragmentation Douglas also mentioned affect on the ability to conduct even cross-border studies, right? It's not only, let's say, just data, let's say, crapping and analysis and availability, but it's also, if I want, let's say, to run a cross-border study in Europe, how does that basically, or what impact that would basically mean from when I take the GDPR inconsistencies maybe into consideration?
Well, the first one is to assume that it's going to take much longer than you expect, because you actually have to consider what are the limitations of each region, what you can do, what you can't actually do, how can you pull the data. For example, do you need the data to stay within that region or not? Then do you need the servers to actually have it there? So I think that it can have a pretty big impact if you don't really know what are the limitations within each country that you're going to work on. And as Douglas mentioned, just in the case of Spain, we have actually 16 different HT organizations. So that means that if you actually want to enter the Spanish market, you have to enter it quite a few times, not only one. So
exactly.
This is to this point, a lot of the data cannot leave. For example, French claims data has to be used and worked with in France. And Germany is also very similar, and Switzerland, even though not part of the EU, very similar to the EU, data cannot leave Switzerland. So you're seeing that these type of studies, even though you may be doing multicultural or multi-country studies, you essentially have to do this across these countries separately and then hope that you can get enough data that, insights rather, that you can aggregate at a summary level. But that is extremely limiting in terms of obviously then harmonizing the data, being able to compare and obviously be able to look at this. And that creates a lot of challenges in terms of, obviously, as Adam mentioned, what access to data you can have, what the actual definitions, what the regional definitions are, and legal limitations. And that may be very fragmented, even hospital.
Yeah, that's obviously, yeah, that's a very important point. I mean, and you mentioned already, I mean, if you just take the example of, let's say, some epidemiological data, I mean, this might already give a huge difference. I mean, between countries, which can anyway happen. But I mean, even if I would be a payer within a country, right? I mean, it might give me the wrong picture across the different regions, which is, which can be the true effect, but you don't know, yes. Right? It could be chance finding, right?
Yeah, this is especially impactful in terms of rare disease, because obviously rare disease by definition are a rare number of patients. And so many times in order to be able to do a study, you need a significant number, which means you have to be looking across regions to actually be able to get a cohort that's big enough that you can do that kind of epidemiology and show value for care. But many times if the HTA is only allowing you to look at local data, then you're never going to really be able to get that sufficient number to do a study locally. So it's becoming an issue in terms of really being able to show value for care for medications. It's also affecting our ability to use AI as a methodology, because obviously the access to data is important for actually machine learning and any type of intelligence building that we might do. So if we can't create access to data, then those type of models really can't be obviously used very well.
Yeah, no, fully agree. And I mean, coming back again very quickly, I mean, you mentioned obviously challenges between countries. You mentioned France and Switzerland, Germany. Data cannot leave the country, which is already a bit of a difficult concept, I would say, at least in the current days. But, leave that maybe as it is, and obviously happy to have your opinion. But where I want to go a bit further, and I'm not an expert again on those kind of, let's say, specific issues, but I think in Germany, we also have a bit of the issue. Obviously, if you are allowed to use those data, those patient level data, you need to anonymize it, right? But I think to remember that I read somewhere that I think after a given time, you basically need to re-identify those kind of data again, right? So it's anonymization at one point in time, but then maybe as well, there's another anonymization happening maybe later on. If you want to combine those data, it's already, let's say, very tricky. So how does that play a role within the GDPR? Is that as well one of the, let's say, results out of GDPR?
That's actually one of the tricky aspects, because under GDPR, there's really not an effective definition of what an anonymized patient record is, that is really just healthcare. Then actually, how would you, at this point, be able to combine that with other data? And right now, we're not allowed to do any sort of tokenization, because there's the idea that if you have a key, then there's a lock that obviously then would allow somebody to re-identify that patient. That patient identification and privacy is extremely important, and that's extremely cultural here in Europe. And I think it's really important that we respect that. But without the technical definition of how we can anonymize that record and make it and separate it from the patient, then we really have no way to use that healthcare record independently and be able to use that on a scientific basis. And that's the key point, is how can we take that data that's obviously derived from the patient, remove the patient information so that it actually is a fully anonymized healthcare record, not a patient record, and do this in a fashion that we can then allow us to use the secondary data more effectively. And this, we have a huge amount of this data because obviously patients are being seen. We have years of diagnosis, medications, treatments, procedures. And this is actually very critical to showing longitudinality and actually looking at effective care, being able to understand patient journeys and see drug safety as well as efficaciousness, and understand where there's actually unmet medical needs that some of the new therapies can address. And that's where we're then creating a natural lag. And I see that competitively, and there now the current political environment, we need to be much more competitive as the EU and be able to kind of do these things a little bit more effectively. The United States has just announced the Stargate program with $500 billion toward AI development in healthcare. That is a monstrous enablement that right now in Europe we're enabling through laws and legislation, but no incentive toward innovation.
Yeah. No, that's obviously another kind of, let's say, question. I mean, we're coming back to, let's say, what EU can maybe learn from the US, maybe take over from the US in a second. I want to still, let's say, stick for a moment as well, still with that, let's say, re-identification or anonymization kind of issue. Would you be thinking that advancements in AI, obviously blockchain is already available since longer time now, would that potentially help in, let's say, getting rid of the issue with anonymization? Or is it still, let's say, as you said, it's still a kind of definition question instead of a methodology question?
I think it's still a definition question. And when we get that defined, then we can start working toward the methodology toward it. Blockchain is a transactional way of using data. It does anonymize the data and the transactions, but it actually builds up a lot of weight on the data itself. So it becomes also very slow to be able to work with that data that way. I do believe that there are other ways where we can depersonalize that data. Even one of the aspects that's being used elsewhere is pseudonymization. And there are some efforts in the EU to start trying to do that. And that would allow you potentially through a pseudonymized mechanism be looking at actually combine different data sets. But that's still a little bit problematic because of obviously GDPR and this inherent risk in potential patient re-identification. And so in some ways, we have to really look at the risk versus reward. And I think there's a greater reward in us being able to use this data on a public healthcare basis to understand disease and be able to understand and treat patients within Europe specifically, and be able to treat our populations while still maintaining that individual privacy and data security.
Yeah, exactly. I read a while ago, I think the quote, which I think was more or less going to the direction, GDPR is for the healthy, which is probably true, I would guess, right? Because, you brought up the example of the orphans before.
Yes.
If I don't have access to the data, this is okay if I'm healthy and I don't need, let's say, the insights from or let's say insights with the data. It doesn't matter in which direction, right?
Yeah.
Once I have the disease, once I need something, right? I need healthcare. Then it gets really into
tricky,
a trouble issue, right? Yeah.
Yes. And I think the EU does have good intents. They want patients to own their own data. They want them to have access to their own data. But let's be honest, most of us as individuals wouldn't know what to do with our own healthcare record. We could have it on a device, but unless there's something that helps us understand what our own comorbidities and risk factors are, what is it doing for us?
Yeah.
And that's where I think that there's a huge aspect of this that's being a little bit lost in terms of good intent, but not really enabling what it's trying to do.
No, agree. So, sorry, yes, Adam, of course. Just go ahead.
No, just following on the topic of GDPR, I think that we even have to go one step back further and try to understand what is the idea of health in the EU. Because I think that we also need to understand what does it feels like it's different to understand what is health, for example, in Spain, as it is in the Nordics, as it is in Central Europe. So GDPR might have been a way of trying to complement that, but I think that we have to find an equilibrium between what is health for each of the different states and what is health for the EU in general, and how can we ensure that actually they are as aligned as possible.
You're bringing up a very important point. I have been part of a panel a couple of years ago where we rather discussed about, let's say it was more healthcare in Europe, right? It was a quite broad discussion. And somebody was basically bringing up the point, look, healthcare and healthcare financing is still a national issue. probably the kind of whole concept with GDPR basically is, right? Because GDPR is not per se a health kind of specific point, right? I mean, GDPR is generally about data, right? And privacy. And I mean, as you said, I think very early on in your introduction, it's basically the data rights for the citizens. And that's already the point, right? We're not even speaking about patients. So maybe the intent was quite good. Douglas, you mentioned that as well, right? I mean, yes, of course, we should own the data. But, and then there's the big but, I mean, if you get into details in some circumstances like healthcare, then you get potentially into trouble. So maybe, and that's obviously quite bigger, right? I mean, but maybe the point, and that goes as well into market access direction, to the market access direction in terms of pricing and healthcare financing, is maybe we first need to even fix the financial issue in healthcare before we could, let's say, change that one. Or I'm not sure, obviously, what is currently ongoing in terms of debates on the GDPR level. Maybe you can as well shed some light on that one.
Right now, I think it's still very much so on a national level, because each of your healthcare, whether it be public, let's say, for example, Germany, even Switzerland, even though we have mandatory healthcare insurance in Switzerland, there's still limits to access because the deductible in some cases for a family could be too much for them to necessarily go to the doctor versus put food on their table. So that becomes actually a natural limitation. In Germany, you have both public healthcare and then private insurance. And those are actually two different systems and actually then two different models of access. And so you see different channels also in each of these countries in terms of obviously patient care and also then care reimbursement. And I think this is a little bit of what you're going toward. And you see the same thing if you want to compare it to Spain or Italy or even France, for example. The simple example is my coming from the United States, where you go to the GP and the GP then kind of maintains all your data, and you go out from the GP then to specialty services. Whereas in other countries, the hospital becomes kind of the central care point, and your GP is actually feeding data into the hospital. So these different systems work differently in terms of data access and who has also control of that data.
Yeah, it's another important point. If I put the hypothesis on there that GDPR is basically prolonging time to market, meaning time to market access, would you agree?
I think that it is a fundamental issue that does trickle all the way up, because it is leading to the inability to obviously use secondary data effectively to show value for care that obviously then would go into health technology assessments to be able to approve and be used for reimbursement and pricing. And so the studies are showing that you're seeing lags in Europe. Many times newer medications are not being even, they may be approved in Europe, but they're not actually being introduced into Europe. And then there's a significant lag for some of these new medications coming into certain countries, many times 5 and 6 years later, after they're introduced into your bigger 4 markets.
So turning that a bit into a positive mode, right? I mean, you mentioned already, I mean, there are examples, and the US is maybe one or maybe the only one, I'm not sure. Which kind of, let's say, learnings or considerations should Europe maybe take over from the US in order to really make the data use, especially in healthcare, maybe at least say more efficiently? Because, I mean, ultimately, I mean, if we say we have a gap until time to market, this would also mean that maybe patients also die earlier, right? Depending a bit on the product.
I think, to be fair, the GDPR was really intended to make sure that, patient or individual data is protected so that it couldn't be used to, against people. And that, I think, is a key fundamental aspect of obviously European definition. At the same time, what we need to do is understand that there's also a public health responsibility toward caring for people, in which each of us is part of a larger group, called humanity, where our data can be used to help us all, and that we actually have an individual responsibility toward that. The thing that I would like is to obviously be able to ensure individual permissions and obviously the access to their own data in healthcare. And I think that's, for example, we're talking in Switzerland around, patient devices where you can hold your own data. And I think that's a very good initiative. there's going to have to be some intelligence around that so people understand what it is and also can use that to catch their own risk and understand where to get to when they have an emergency. These things are very useful, but there's also a public health responsibility each of us have, which is to allow our data to be used anonymized so that everybody can understand our journey, how we've lived, and be able to gain from that intelligence and experience. That's the aspect that I see missing within the EU legislation, is also the importance of public health.
One point to add would be also when it comes to innovation. We speak a lot about when it comes to big companies. There's of course the time to market being longer and such, but for smaller companies, it might actually mean that they go out of the market. So this is also something that we have to consider, because at some point, many startups have to consider, does it even make sense to stay in the EU? Because maybe with the same amount of investment or similar, they can actually go to a bigger market and actually have a chance. While in the EU, they would have actually to go through each of the different markets trying to get reimbursement, which in a mostly public healthcare-based system, unless you're actually reimbursed, it's pretty hard to actually make a living.
You're seeing this with a lot of most of the newer drug launches are in the United States, which is the world's largest healthcare market. And that's where everybody goes, because a single FDA approval gives you access to over 330 million lives. And then Germany's in Europe, the second largest with 8% of the global GDP for healthcare. And so you see this trickle down. And unfortunately, in some cases, if they can't show the value and get the reimbursement they need in Germany, they're not even introducing the drug into the European market. And they're oftentimes then selling the rights to somebody else to commercialize it and go through that process, and only retaining the rights for the US market. So you're seeing that kind of hiccup and slowdown, or even handoff in some cases.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. I mean, if I would be a company, maybe let's say from outside of Europe, and I have had already the decision to go to Europe, so I decide already positively internally, what would be your recommendations when it would come to the use of real-world data / maybe I want or need to run a real-world evidence study across Europe? What would be your kind of key recommendation for such a company?
The first place you've got to go is Germany, because Germany is the big first, healthcare market in Europe. And so you've got to, obviously be able to identify and work and find data sources in Germany for that. There are a number of sources that you can work with in different hospitals and so forth, but that's actually even an issue within Germany, is where is that common data source that you could possibly work with? So that's also becomes an issue. France would be next. Then obviously you see Italy and Spain after that. The Nordics and Benelux, and then obviously Switzerland, we tend to fall and come in after those. And then Eastern European is kind of the last tier, many times 5 and 6 years later. But the first place is always going to be in Germany, because right now that's the largest healthcare market. And it is still fragmented, even, I would say, state to state within Germany. Baden-Württemberg is not Bayern. Schleswig-Holstein is, not Nordrhein-Westfalen, things like this. So you're going to find, even state to state, some different access to data and obviously different systems.
Yeah, but this would basically mean you would recommend go country by country, also with respect to real-world evidence generation.
You really have to, because you're still going to have to be looking at reimbursement and pricing and negotiating on a country level. That's the issue right now. You can't, even though you can get an EU approval for that medication in terms of its safety and efficacy and approval there, you still have to go country by country to get the pricing and reimbursement negotiations started.
Yeah. So perfect. I mean, we have basically discussed now for roughly 30 minutes. So we went towards the end. Final thing for both of you. What are you expecting in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years with respect to real-world evidence / GDPR / market access? So what is your expectation for the future?
Well, I'm going to be optimistic, because I think that the climate's changed very quickly just this week. And I think that Europe needs to align and be much more self-sufficient. And I think that also comes into healthcare. We don't have the time and the luxury, for a 10-year plan, and then we're going to come out with something on the other end that's not even no longer effective. We have to be light. We have to be more responsive. I think that individual countries, and I think that Germany, being one of the largest within the EU, is going to have to take some leadership on this and really kind of set a direction. Within the EU, the larger GDPs obviously have more say, and they can set that kind of direction. And so I think that the individual member countries will have to lead and say, we want to do this, and we want this to obviously be a collective and not just us, and then France, and then Italy, then Spain, and then everybody else. We need to kind of create this as a common healthcare, public health issue.
Adam, what are your thoughts?
So I'm also quite optimistic. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the European health data space and the new joint clinical assessment is going to work out, especially because both of them actually require all of the countries to try to standardize things, which will require to actually most likely revisit what GDPR really means, because otherwise it's going to stay the same.
Yeah.
And I think that it's also going to be interesting in the sense of, if we really want to implement a joint clinical assessment and European health data space, at some point we'll have to also take into account that healthcare in each of the different countries is actually different.
Yes.
So how do we ensure that there is a standard of European healthcare? How do we ensure that there is a standard of quality? I think that it will be very interesting, because we'll have to revisit these questions and what it really means and what it actually means to be the EU, so to call it.
Right. I do see, like, for example, Adam mentioned these joint clinical assessments, which are now being required as part of, HTAs. This is now kind of going across border, and for oncology, that's where it's starting. But that could really help this very much so, because it's then going to require that broadening view and actually perspective across the wider region. That, I think, is a very, very good thing. But as Adam mentioned, that clinical assessment and how clinics and so forth, we also need to kind of see how that's being formulated in each of these individual countries for that assessment.
Yeah, no, fully agree. Perfect. Guys, it was a great discussion. I learned a lot as well in those, let's say, a bit more than 30 minutes. So thanks a lot as well for that. And looking forward how the whole kind of, let's say, healthcare market in Europe will be shaping as well in the next kind of years. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you for your time, Stefan.
Thanks, yeah. Cheers.
This time another topic. It's much broader than just market access. So we discussed today about GDPR, so the privacy on data in Europe has been already implemented quite a while ago. But I think the impact, what we have just heard, might be just beyond what maybe politicians have also thought about. So ultimately, it might also have the impact because maybe GDPR might maybe delay time to market through, let's say, the delay of running appropriate, maybe as well, real-world evidence studies on epidemiology, on comparators, or any other kind of type, not only thinking about drugs, but also about medtech products, where maybe safety is very important then as well. So this is an important consideration. And also what Douglas said towards the end of the podcast is an important one. Of course, from their perspective at least, each real-world evidence study would maybe still need to be run within a country. So a pan-European one is at least still very difficult. Anyhow, I think very important, and that's, I think, bringing us towards the end of that, let's say, session. There's also positive signals, a positive idea at least from both participants today that maybe there will be some important changes happening as well in the next couple of very few years. Let's just see that one. And the other important point is, of course, when taking not only GDPR, you can probably leave that out there, but the ultimate message around that is clearly plan appropriately, plan early enough in order then to also have everything up and ready when you would need to launch in a given market. That was an episode of MAP, the market access podcast provided by Mars Market Access and Pricing Strategy, which is your healthcare consultancy in the German-speaking markets. MAP is available every second week with a new episode, so watch out. And in case you might have questions, contact me directly and/or visit our website on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de.